I wanted to show you some more art, especially these two pieces I'm going to show you at the end of my living room. This is a face by Dale Crawford, a young artist I met at the Ringling many, many years ago, and he had this up for sale, and I grabbed it immediately. It's gorgeous. And about that same time, Bill Niblock, who's a sailor and a boat builder and a sculptor, a wood sculptor, made me this skipjack dory. It's 1/3 size of the boats that used to ply Sarasota Bay. I love this boat. It's been in my dreams for I don't know how long, since I saw one in a painting of Andrew Wyeth called The Revenant, but his was in a hayloft. This is hanging from my ceiling. I just love its presence, and I love its balance too. You Bill did a great job on that. His wife at the time made my stained glass windows, which you'll see from time to time, way high up. They're beautiful.
When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a cowboy. And I liked that whole thing about the cowboy hats and the guns, and of course that in fact my brother was one who usually got the guns and the hats and the stuff. Once in a while I get to wear them too because I insisted, and my mom used to dress me up as an Indian, which I liked also, with the feathers and when you had a little tomahawk you could chase people with and all the rest of that stuff. That was about where I expected to be. When people say, well, Justin, what are you going to be when you grow up? And I'd be 5 or 6, and I'd say, well, I'm going to be a cowboy, or I'm going to be an Indian. That's as far as I got. There are some people who have a 5-year plan and a life plan and a 10-year plan of where they're going to be and where they think they're going to be. I have never operated that way. My whole life has just been a response to some internal guide, and I don't know how to describe that guide, but in fact I had the sensation that even though I had no idea where I was going, that something internal in me was bringing me to certain places. I've led a very wild career. I can't tell you the things I've done in the computing field, and it was a field that I got into very early. It was like Hollywood back in the 20s. As long as you were smart and you were willing to be active, you could make some money, and I made a lot of money, and I wound up having my own company with another fellow. I was the president of Oxford Software. We made a lot of money, but it wasn't my calling. It just happened to just bring me to a point where I could say one day, I'm getting out of this and I'm returning to poetry. I was writing poetry with my left hand and making money with my right, and you can't do that. You have to, if you're going to be an artist, you really have to do it full time. And what I realized one day was that my left arm had become completely withered, and my right arm was strong, but it was shaky. I was drinking too much. This was not where I belonged, so I sold my half of the company. It was worth a lot of money at the time, and it allowed me to go back full-time to poetry. When I look back at it now, I can see that almost everything that happened to me was in some way set me up for my life as an artist, even though that life started relatively late, in my late 30s, where I finally just chucked everything and I went back to it and I started to gear up again to get into it. But I gained skills, and I gained a kind of orneriness and, in fact, the ability to stick to my guns and to have enough money not to bend to anybody else's will about what poetry should be or what art should be. I had my own instincts were firm at a very young age, and in fact have remained firm. And you really, if I were to take a look at that, I would say that from a very early age I always felt that art should be something that should be essential. It just shouldn't be your fabrication. But art is, in the main today, concerned about fabrication, clever fabrication, sophisticated fabrication. I don't care whether it's dance or music or whatever it happens to be. But there's very little of it is going to portray the human comedy or the human tragedy, as we could call it, life itself, in all of its rich dimensions. I always felt that art should be concerned with that. It should come from some deep source, and in fact it should reveal itself. So that now, when I look back at it, I've had the ability to do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. I put a lot of time in that I didn't want to put in my business career, but when I finally, when it came time for me, I could do what I wanted to do, and I had confidence in my own opinions, and I wasn't about to be bullied or swayed by others. If it felt right, I would listen, but if it didn't feel right, that door closed. That was an opinion I just didn't need because it wasn't true for me. I was always a well-read kid. I read a lot of the Bible, and I knew my nursery rhymes, which I think both are the foundations of any poet. But I wasn't one of those kids who was reading all of the poets in high school or in grade school. I went to pretty ordinary schools, So when I got to college, and I wound up, I was supposed to be a science major because I had all kinds of scholarships. These were the days of Sputnik, so everybody had to become an engineer, and I decided, well, maybe I should do that too. And my parents said yes, and the school said yes, and the Scholarship Foundation said yes, so I wound up as a science major. But somehow, in my sophomore year, I stepped into an English class for 17th century literature, poetry, which is the great poetry, the century for English poetry, and my mind just kind of blew open. I realized that I had an affinity for poetry that I had been disregarding, and that I just knew everything about poetry. I knew the poets. I could tell who wrote what poem, even if I'd never seen it before. If you have good poets, there's a little kind of essence of them is in that. And I just fell head over heels in love with poetry, and I just pursued it. And then I had to go through that business career and raise kids, and I was trying to do that and trying to make a living. When I was finally able to come back to it with those tools that I'd spoken about before, about being financially independent and having very firm ideas about what poetry should be, I was able to act on them. Somehow, at a very early age, I felt that art should come out of you effortlessly. There should be no effort in it. If there's effort, if there's writer's block, all that stuff we read about is because it's being consciously formed. The deeper part of us, the soul, whatever you want to call it, knows what it wants to say. We just have to accommodate it. And I think any good poet understands that, although there's so much poetry being written today and in the past that is just nice thoughts or poetic thoughts. They're just kind of conscious thoughts. But the great poems, the ones we go back to time after time, are always just come out of us like a breeze. They come out of the poet like a breeze. They just come out of how sad or how dark or how uplifting, whatever it happens to be. It just came as one flow from the deep, deep heart. That has always been a dictum to me. That's the way that should happen. I have no time for any other poetry. I would skip the whole 18th and 19th century in English poetry, just throw it out the window, except for maybe a little bit of Emily Dickinson, a little bit of Walt Whitman, and a little bit of Hardy, but I would just throw it out. And the 20th century has some marvelous poets who are doing the real thing. That feeling and that kind of inner conviction that nobody ever taught me as to what poetry should be allowed me eventually to see that poetry has no form. So that's something that even poets don't understand today. You talk to them about oral poetry, musical poetry, they don't quite get it. They think it's a kind of debased form of written poetry. But poetry existed for tens of thousands of years before we learned how to read and write. It has its own genius and its own way of coming out. It's the most pure, most primal form of poetry, and it's the one that's the least liable to tampering by the conscious mind. You just can't do it. It comes to you too fast. But in fact, it allowed me to follow that thread back down into the deep heart of poetry, and in fact, eventually into the ability to make audiovisual poems, which are like in Bach fugues, with a picture and music and soundtracks and poems working in the written and in the oral, multi-voiced mode. Because what happens is you become sensitive to the poetry that's inside you, how it wants to come out. And it wants to come out for me in a many-voiced manner. It wants to come out just as full as life is itself. I can see sometimes why Shakespeare had a tough time writing his lyric poems. He often seemed to be a little unbalanced. The last couplet, Robert Lowell said, it looked like he ran through all his poems one night and tacked the two-line couplet on the end of them. He wanted to get to something larger. That's why he was a dramatic poet. He needed a larger canvas, and in some sense I need a more dense canvas. That's what that poetry will take any form that you allow it to take and that it wants to take. You're like a midwife. A poet should be like a midwife. If the baby wants to come out leg first or arm first or head first or butt first, your job is to get the baby out that way. That's the way the baby wants to come. Forget about all the theories about how babies should be born. Your job is to make that possible. And that's what the poet should be doing too. And to keep the conscious mind out of it, the unconscious mind is the baby coming off, and you have to somehow get adept and just let it come out in whatever form it wants: musical, audiovisual, written, multi-voice, spontaneous, whatever happens. The soul will sing if you allow it to sing, and how it sings is it sings through the act of poetry, which brings the conscious and the unconscious selves together in a way like no other art that we have.
Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm playing ball with my uncles, like I did when I was a kid. My mother thought they were nuts. All they do is play ball all day, she said. And they're grown men, too. But I didn't care. I loved playing with them. They knew everything about the game. And they didn't know it because they read it in books or somebbe taught them. They knew it because they loved the game. They couldn't stop playing it. And they treated me just like one of them. They knew I loved to play. It's been a long time now, but I still remember them coming up to me after the game was over, and they'd be all sweaty and they'd smell like smoke and soap, and they'd say to me, Justin, that's all there is, you know. Just find something that you really like and do it all the time, the best you can, the very best you can. Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm playing ball with my uncles, like I did when I was a kid. My mother thought they were nuts. All they do is play ball all day, she said. And they're grown men, too. But I didn't care. I loved playing with them. They knew everything about the game. And they didn't know it because they read it in books or somebody taught them. They knew it because they loved the game. They couldn't stop playing it. And they treated me just like one of them. They knew I loved to play. It's been a long time now, but I still remember them coming up to me after the game was over, and they'd be all sweaty and they'd smell like smoke and soap, and they'd say to me, Justin, that's all there is, you know. Just find something that you really like and do it all the time. The best you can. The very best you can.